Today's daf is daf Lamed Aleph. Let's see. Yeah, brachos uklolos. This is Parshas Otzai. Brachos for those who follow the path of Hashem, the clothes for those who rebel against God, and to tell us about the paradios that comes as a result of sin, and if they do tshuva, then they'll be spared from these sorrows. So that's the brachos uklolos that we're going to read on tiny when we are threatened with various possible catastrophes. Aim of seeking beklolos, once you call up someone for an aliyah in the klolos, then we're not mafsik ela echrei. Second. Yeah. Let me just see if here. Okay. Then he says, "B'sheni b'chamishi u'v'shabbos korim b'seder hayom, seder parshas gesidron. V'ein olam lahem min ha'cheshbon shel kriya b'shabbos shel achreim." In other words, the fact that we read, let's say, what would be the equivalent to the first aliyah, or maybe even the first three aliyahs, that doesn't in any way reduce the amount of kriya that we do on Shabbos. And what's the source for a special kriya on Yontif, which is called Me'inyan HaMoed, Vaydaber Hashem is Moedei Hashem al Bnei Yisrael, Pasuk in Emor, Mitzvasin Shukorin Kol Echad V'Echad Bizman. So the mitzvah is to read the parashas on the Moedim, each parasha on its Moed. Tana Rabbana, we learned to the Brisa, Pesach, Korim V'Parshas Moedos. This is the parasha in Vayikra Perek Chav Beis. In Parshas Emor, this is the parsha that's going to come up over and over again as we go through the sugya, because this is the classic parsha of the Moed. So now we're talking about Pesach, but we'll soon talk about other Moed. Umaftirin bePesach Gilgal. So this is in Sefer Yoshua, and at the time of Yoshua, in a place called Gilgal, that's when they brought the Korban Pesach. And that's recorded in the 5th chapter of the book of Yoshua. And now we have Yontif Sheni Shel Golios, right? Therefore, we have 2 days. Yom HaKam on the first day, Pesach Gilgal, the Haftarah will be from Pesach Gilgal. Ulamachar, and on the extra day of Yontif, the 8th day of Pesach, then Pesach Yoshio. Yoshio, who is the king of Israel, he also brought a Korban Pesach, and that is recorded in Malachim Beis in Perek Chav Gimel. And this is after Yeshayahu destroyed the Bamos and the Geshkes, the Psilim, and he commanded the people to bring the Korban Pesach. And during the years of Shmuel and Novi, they would not makriv the Korban Pesach berov am ubetar. So this was a very special occasion during the Malchus of Yeshayahu and Novi. That's what we're going to read on as Haftorah on Yontif Achron. Ushar Yamos HaPesach. What about during Chol HaMoed? So we have another 4 days of Chol HaMoed, right? We have first 2 days of Yontif, then 4 days, and then the last 2 days of Yontif. Is Malakid V'Korim in Yonot Shaltet. We look throughout the Torah and collect those sections of the Torah that would be relevant to the Moed of Pesach. Mahi, what are these sections that we should be reading respectively on the 4 days? Simon. So this is a pneumatic device, Mapu. These are Rashi Tevos. Rashi goes through it for the 4 kriyos during the 4 days of Chol Moed Pesach, based on the Seder Hayomim from the 3rd day of Pesach until and including the 6th day of Pesach. So the Mem of Mapu stands for Mishchu Ukechu Lachem Tzonu Mishpachoseim B'Shachatu Pesach in Parshas Bo. And that's the Korban Pesach and Yitzias Mitzrayim. Then we get to the second letter of this mnemonic device, which is Aleph. And that is an allusion to Im Kesef Talve Es Ami, which is also in Sefer Shmos. Fast forwarding to Perek Chav Beis, and there the three regalim are mentioned. Then we get to the letter Pei, and that's a reference to Psolacha Shnei Luchos Avonim Karishonim in Parshas Kitisa. There too, the three regalim are mentioned. And finally, the last letter of this mnemonic device Vav is an allusion to Vayidaber Hashem El Moshe b'Midbar Sinai v'Yasu Bnei Yisrael es HaPosach b'Moado in Parshas Ba'aloscha. That's a reference to Pesach Sheni. The Brisa continues. The Yontiv Ha'achron Shel Pesach, which in Eretz Yisrael will be the Shvi Shel Pesach, and even in Chutzlaretz, we're referring right now to Shvi Shel Pesach. Korin Vayihi B'Shalach. This is the parsha. This week's parsha is in fact of Kriyas Yamsuf and the recitation of the Shira. That's of course what happened on the seventh day of Pesach. It's very interesting. My Rebbe used to always talk about this. Why is it that they recited Shira on the seventh day of Pesach at Yamsuf and not on the night of Yitzias Mitzrayim a week earlier? Why did they postpone it? And Moshe Rabbeinu seemed to have postponed it for a full week. Umaftirin, we read in the Navi, Vaydaber David Lashem es divrei Ashira Azos. This is called Shiras David. And this gives a parallel between the Shira of Bnei Yisrael, the Yamsuf, and the Shira of David. And David HaMelech in his Shir, in fact, mentions Yitzias Mitzrayim. L'machar, on Yotav Sheni Shel Golias, the 8th day of Pesach, we read the Parsha of Kol B'chor, Umaftirin Od Hayom. So in the Parsha of Kol B'chor, which is in the 15th chapter of Sefer Dvarim, again, the Torah mentions the three regalim. And in Yeshayahu HaNavi, in the 10th chapter, it says Od Hayom, and that's a nevuah in which Yeshayahu is prophesying about the downfall of Sancherev, which actually took place on the night of the 15th of Nisan. And therefore it's connected to Chag HaPesach. Omar Abaye. Abaye tells us what's the Seder HaKriyah today during Pesach. But in today, Nog Alma, the Minigo Olam is Levikri, that we read on the days of Pesach according to the following mnemonic device. This is this. We start with Mishal Torah, then Kaddish B'Kaspa, then Psol B'Midbara, and then finally Shalach Buchra. So each one of these two-word phrases alludes to a particular kriya. On the first day, we're going to read Mishal Torah, which is a shar, and that's the parsha in Shmos Yud Beis and Parshas Bo of Mishchu Ukchu Lachem. And on the second day, we read Torah, the Hainu Shar O Kesev O Eiz Ki Voled in Parshas Emor, and that's the Parsha of the Moedim in Torah's Kohen. On the third day, we read Kadesh, and that is Kadesh Li Kol B'char in Shmos Parak Yud Gimel. Again, there's Yitzias Mitzrayim, the laws of Korban Pesach are mentioned there. On the fourth day, B'Kaspa, which is in Kesev Talves Ami. On the fifth day, we read Pisol, which is in Parshas Kitisa, Vayom Hashem al Moshe Psolach al Shnei Luchot Zafonim, and Vayom Hashishi, we read B'Midbara, Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe B'Midbar Sinai, Vayasu Bnei Yisrael HaPosach B'Moadim. Again, Pesach Sheni, in Parshas Ba'aloscha B'Shvi Shel Pesach, Korin Shlach. Vayihi B'Shalach Paro Es. So this is not Parshas Shlach and Bamidbar, but rather Parshas B'Shalach in the 13th chapter of Shmos. On the last day of Pesach, for the Chutznikim, we read Buchra, which is Kol B'char Asher Yivoled. Batzeres, what do we read on Shavuos? Shiva Shavuos. This is in Parshas Re'ei Dvarim, Perek Zayin. Maftirin, we read the Maftir in Chavakuk, because in Chavakuk there's a description of Matan Torah. It says there, Elokam Iteman Yovo, Kadosh Maher Paran Sela, and Chazal in Masechet Avodah Zarah Dash that before HaKadosh Baruch gave the Torah to Israel, he went about to all the Umas HaOlam, Taman, which means the south, and Paran, he went to Yishmael, etc., and every nation refused to accept the Torah except for Israel. Acherim, according to another sheet as to what we read on Shavuos, is Bachodesh Hashlishi. Let's say this is Parshas Yisro. States Bnei Yisrael, they're both with Bar Sinai, and there we get Maimed Har Sinai. Maftirin b'Merkava. This is Yechezkel's Nevuah, the chariots, because the time in Torah, because Baruch came down onto Har Sinai, Behod Merkav Do. And Bnei Yisrael reached the level, all of Bnei Yisrael on Torah of Nevuah. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu revealed at Sinai, Deravos, Alfei Shnon, Malchei Morom, Rechev, Rabasayim, Alfei Shnon, Hashem Bom, Sinai Kodesh, Bakodesh. But in the Dikatrei Yomi, we have 2 days of Shavuos, Abdina, Charvayu, Ve'ibcha. We follow both Shittas, Tanakama, and the Eish Omer, but just in the opposite sequence. On the first day of Shavuos, which is the 6th of Sivan, we're going to read Bachodesh HaShlishi, and that reflects the Shitta that the Torah was given on the 6th of Sinai. And then we read the Haftorah from the Merkava, which is a reflection of the time of Matan Torah when HaKadosh Baruch came down on our Sinai b'Merkav Tov. That's on the first day of Shavuos. On the second day of Shavuos, we're going to read Bachodesh HaShlishi, and we're going to read the Haftorah of Merkava. Okay, fine. Now, Rosh Hashanah Korim, Bachodesh HaShvi Bechel HaChodesh, again, another section from Vayikra of Gimel from Parshas Emor, that's in Yonah Shel Yom Haftirin, Haben Yakir Li Ephraim, Ki Midei Dabri Bo Zocher Esperno Od, Rachem Rachamenu Num Hashem, Yirmiyah, Perek Lamed Aleph. Why? Because the word Zocher Askerenu and Rachem Rachamenu that are mentioned in that parsha Novi are Minyono Shel Yom, because this is a day of Zichronos. We ask Hashem to remember us for Rachamim. Yesh Omer, according to another opinion, on Rosh Hashanah, we should read V'Hashem Pakades Sarah Umaftirin Chana, V'Chana, because in both cases of Sarah and Chana, Hashem remembered them on Rosh Hashanah to have children. But in the Dikatrei Yomi, we have 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. Yom HaKam on the first day. Yesh Omer, we're going to read Hashem Pakades Sarah, and we're going to be Maftir B'Chana. Ulamacha on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, Elokim Nisas Avraham. And this is the way that we ask Hashem to remember Akedes Yitzchak when He's judging us. Umaftirin Ben Yakir Ephraim, etc. Yirmiyah Perek Lamed Aleph. Yom Kippurim, in the morning of Yom Kippur, Orin Achrimot, which is fascinating that we read the Parsha of Arayos. And I'm sorry, we didn't get Arayos yet. That's going to be Mincha. We're in Shabbos. I jumped to go to them. So Achrimos is the Avodas Hayom, and of course the story of the death of Nadav V'Avihu. And he quotes here in the footnote to Zohar, who says, Mishum Itztar al Misas Aaron, B'nei Aaron, O Morit Mosalim, is Mochlelo al Kol Avonosav. So that's the Kriya of Yom Kippurim. And the Maftir is Ki Koamar Ram Venisa, Yeshaya Perek Nun Zayin. And there the Navi is talking about Darki Tshuva and Tainios, Solu Palam Derech, Harimu Michshol, Miderech Ami. Ubemincha, this is a Pella that I mentioned earlier, Korin Be'arayos. Read in Parshas Kedoshim about the Arayos, these Arayos. Apparently, the assumption is that the Yitzhahar of Arayos is very, very powerful, so we need on Yom Kippurim to think about removing all the Mechshalos and overcoming this Chemda and this Yitzhahara and this very powerful Yitzhahara. Of course, the Gemara tells us in Yoma and also in Bava Kama that the Anshe Knesset Agdola prayed to do away with the Yetzer Hara Farayas. They were only partially successful. Kodesh Baruch Hu said, without the Yetzer Farayas, there won't be anything left on the world. No one will propagate. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu removed the Yetzer Hara for the Arayas to close relatives. So in Mincha time, when we're reaching the highest point of holiness and purity, after all these hours and hours of tshuva and vidui, we still remind ourselves at the end of the day, the Yetzer Hara is still powerful. And this, my Rebbe used to always say, teaches us that tshuva is universal and applies for every nation on the face of the earth. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Kol Maka, this is a little bit of an agadic kind of interlude. So you find that God's greatness, and then you find God's humility. Ki Hashem Elokechem Hu Elokei Elokim. So this is Guras Shal Hashem, Uksiv Basrei. And immediately afterwards, in the very next pasuk, it says, "Oseh mishpat yasom b'almana, ohev ger laseis lo lechem v'simla." This is the anvenuso shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the great humility that He has hashgacha on those who are weak, the weaker echelon of society, that don't have the power to save themselves from those who are subjugating them and stealing and swindling from them. And God says, "I will do the mishpat of the yasam and the almana." Shani Benavim, Shenemar Yishaya Zayin, Kicho Amar Hashem, Kicho Amar Ram V'Nisa, Shochein Ad V'Kadosh. And this is all the greatness of Hashem. Uksiv Basrei, and it says immediately afterwards, in the very same pasuk, V'Yasdaka Ushfal Ruach, Lahachios Ruach Shfolim, Lahachios Leiv Nidkoyim. Hashem is right there with those who are downtrodden and Hashem depressed. And that's why a Jew who's in Golus is, as you know, is an expression of atzvus, of sadness. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to give that person in Golus a ha'ara, some sort of an awakening, a light. Because Hashem cares for everyone, no matter how far they've gone and how far removed they are from the right derech. They're sinners, but nevertheless, V'esdako u'shfal ruach lahachios. Meshulash v'ksuvim t'tziv solu l'roche ba'arovos v'yah shmo. Which means that we should praise and give romams, to loftiness to Hashem, who's the Rochev al Shamayim. And we should fear His great name, Uksiv Basrei Avi Yisomim V'Dayan Almonos. That God is in that pasuk is the father of the orphans, and He is the representative, the defense for the Almonos. Now we get to Sukkot. Korin v'Parshas Modosh. Let's go. Once again, we read the Parsha of Sukkot from Emor. Umaftirin Hinei Yom Va Hashem. Lashem. This is the great prophecy of Zechariah about the destruction and the downfall of Gog and Magog when the latter comes to attack Yerushalayim at the end of days. And we're going to be maftir with Hine Yom Ba Hashem, because it says there in the Pasuk, V'olu Hanisharim Bagoyim Midei Shana B'Shana L'Shtachos L'Melech Hashem Tzvakos L'Choges Chag HaSukkot. I suppose this Haftorah of Zechariah is really meant to convey those feelings of brotherhood towards humanity, towards mankind in general, that there is still potential in mankind, that at the time of Mashiach, they will be inspired. And that's why they have Lahavdil El Favdos, like a lot of Christians come here on Sukkot time, what's called Feast of the Tabernacles, whatever. That's all based on Zechariah. But in the Dika Yom, now we have Yontif Sheni. L'mocha on the second day of Yontif of Sukkot, Mikra na Hochidami Krina. We'll again read the same parsha of Odos a second time, repeating it as we did on the first day of Yontif. But as far as the Haftorah is concerned, Hafturei Mai, what should be the Haftorah? Maftirin, not from Zechariah, but rather from Perek Ches in Lachamal. Famous Perek Ches, which is Chanukas, Beis HaMikdash on the part of Shlomo Melech, Vayikalu El HaMelech Shlomo, V'yerech HaYisonim, B'chag, Shehu HaChodesh HaShvi. And that's where they were dedicated to the Chanukas Habayis. And there was a great asifa on Chag HaSukkos. And now the Gemara asks, what about Shar Yemos HaChag? Like we spoke about Pesach in terms of the days of Chol HaMoed. What about the days of Chol HaMoed of Sukkot? What you would be laning? And the answer is Korim B'Karbanos HaChag. We're going to read from Parshas Pinchas about the Musafim of the Chag. Does he mention here anything about the whole thing? Yes. He doesn't say anything. Okay, Yontif Ha'achron. Okay, now we're talking about Shmini Atzeres. Korim Kol HaBachar, again from Dvarim Tesvav. And we begin actually from the previous parsha, which is called Aser Ta'aser. So that's in Dvarim Yudalid. And that parsha has mitzvos v'chukim. In other words, there's a shaychus here to Chag HaSukkos, which is the time of Osif. And therefore we read the parsha of Kol HaBachar, which mentions the Shol Gomaftir, and the Haftorah is from Malach Mal Perek Ches, that same chapter that we spoke about earlier, Vayhi Kechalos Shlomo Livnos' Beis Hashem is Beis HaMelech. And afterwards it says that Shlomo Melech sent the people home on Shmini Atzeres after they had celebrated in Yerushalayim the entire holiday of Sukkot. At the end of this period of time, they had finished Chanukas Habayis, and that's what we're going to read on Sukkot, the Haftorah of Vayhi Kechalos Shlomo L'mochar on Yontif Sheni. First of all, what's the Kriya? It's Korin V'zos HaBracha. And this is the end of all the Moed, the way it was organized in the Torah. And therefore we complete with a bracha of Birech Moshe Rabbeinu Es Yisrael. Umaftirin vayamod Shlomo. Again, from that same chapter of Chanukah Beis HaMikdash of Shlomo, it's a tefillah that Shlomo Melech prayed to Hashem at the end of the Chag after the Chanukah Habayis. Omer Avunam Rav Shabbos Shechalios B'Chol HaMoed Bein B'Pesach Bein B'Sukkos Mikra Karinon Re'eh, which is in Parshas Kitisa, in the aftermath of the Chet HaEgel, Re'ato Mary Lai. And there are three inyanim that are related to that day. There's Shabbos, there's Shalosh Regalim, and there's Chol HaMoed. So there's like a package deal in this Parsha of Re'eh, many multi-dimensional. V'afturei, now we're ready for the Haftorah. And we say that b'Pesach, Asamos HaYeveshos, u'B'Sukkos B'Yom Bo Go. So in Pesach, we will read the chapter Lamed Zayin in the Yechezkel of the dried bones, and that's a reference to the Bnei Ephraim, who jumped the gun, and they left Mitzrayim earlier before the case. They were killed by the Plishtim. and Yechezkel resuscitates them. Now, also in Yechezkel, in the case of Milchemes Gog uMagog, which had been mentioned in Zechariah, we read Bo, the Yom Bo Gog uMagog. Let me just see. I think I saw it in the English translation, the discussion about Gog uMagog. Just see. A minute, if you don't mind. I know which see press for time. Just want to see. 56. So he says, Yechezkel tells us how God will punish and defeat the host of Gog, who has come to wage war in Eretz Yisrael. The war referred to is the same as mentioned in the Nevuah of Zechariah, in which we read the Haftarah on the first day of the Chag. That Haftarah's association with Sukkot is based on the passage's reference to the behavior of the nations on the festival of Sukkot in the aftermath of battle. There's also a tradition that the resurrection of the dead will occur in Nisan, but the war of Gog and Magog will take place. So the Haftarah of the dry bones is appropriate to the Chol HaMoed of Pesach, and that of Gog to Sukkot. B'Chanukah, B'Nisiyim. So we read Parshas Noso, which is right before Balos Haneros, because that tells us about the Hakrava of the Karbonos of the Nisiyim at the time of Chanukah HaMizbeach, when the Mishkan was complete. And on Shabbat Chanukah, we will read a Haftarah from Neros Zechariah. And in the 4th chapter of Zechariah, the Nevuah of Zechariah, Ra'isi v'nei menoras zahav kula. And he sees a beautiful, gorgeous vision of a golden candelabra and so forth and so on, which is appropriate for Chanukah, the holiday of Shemin Menorah. The Miklot Shtei Shabbosos. Sometimes, and it's quite frequent, you have 2 Shabbosos within the 8 days of Chanukah. Kamaisa, the first Haftarah, the first Shabbos, is B'Neros Zechariah. And Basraisa, on the second Shabbos, is Neros Shlomo. Once again, in Malachim Aleph, this time Perek Zayin, there we read about the Neros that Shlomo Melech established in the Beis HaMikdash. But the strange thing is that we give preference to Neros Zechariah. And he quotes 2 answers to that question. My Rebbe had his own approach, but he says that Zechariah is a Nevuah ala Osid, whereas Neros Shlomo is about to pass. Furthermore, Zechariah was prophesizing about Bayis Sheni, and that's the period of time when Chanukah, the Ness of Chanukah, took place. Bepurim Vayovo Amalek, which I believe is from Parshas Shalom, correct? Where are we? Bepurim Vayovo Amalek. It doesn't tell you. Okay, I'm pretty sure it's Parshas Shalom, this week's part. Rosh Chodashim v'Rosh Chodashim. Rosh Chodesh Chalils b'Shabbos Maftirin from Yeshayahu Hanavi v'Haya midei Chodesh b'Chodsho. So the parsha in Yeshaya Perek Samachvav mentions Rosh Chodesh. Al lios b'Echad b'Shabbos. If tomorrow, Sunday, is going to be Rosh Chodesh Mei Esmol Maftirin, on Shabbos, we, in anticipation of Sunday Rosh Chodesh, we read Vayomelo Yonasan Machar Chodesh. That's when Yonasan warns David HaMelech not to show up for this party, the celebration of Rosh Chodesh, because Shaul is out to get him.